Welcome to Echoes of My Imagination. My name is Tracy Lee. Sit back, relax. Let me tell you a story. Today's story is part 5 of The Lost Currents of Atlantis and Mew, written by Tracy Thompson. In the ancient long noon of Earth, Mew lived in quiet harmony with the planet's living pulse, until the builders of Atlantis, guided by the mysterious architects, severed that current and set their great stone empire on the slow path to ruin. Let's get into it. Chapter 18. The sea withdrew before the next shock arrived. It happened slowly at first. Water along the outer harbor of Atlantis pulled away from the docks as if something beneath the ocean floor had taken a deep breath and drawn the surface downward. Ships settled awkwardly against their moorings. The bottoms of the canals showed for the first time in generations, slick with dark mineral deposits and small silver fish left flapping in the sudden shallows. People gathered along the edges of the stone embankments and stared at the exposed seabed. One of the harbor pilots spoke first. "Move the vessels," he said. But before anyone could act, the water surged back. A long wall of ocean rolled inward through the harbor gates and flooded the canals with a heavy crash. The surge climbed the stone edges and spilled across the streets, washing tools, baskets, and loose stone into the lower walkways. The tremor followed seconds later. It did not feel like the earlier vibrations. Those had moved like ripples through a pond. This one struck like a hammer against the bones of the city. The ground lifted, then dropped. Several of the tall quartz towers rang with a sharp tone as the vibration passed through their crystal cores. Inside the amplifier chambers, technicians grabbed hold of the stone railings, while the instruments around them rattled violently. One crystal housing cracked along its base. The sound was small, almost delicate, but the effect was immediate. A burst of light flashed through the chamber as the crystal core inside lost alignment. The steady hum that had filled the room for centuries stuttered and collapsed into a chaotic roar of overlapping frequencies. The technician closest to it staggered backward. "Shut it down!" someone shouted. But it was too late. The crystal shattered, not explosively, but violently enough that shards of clear stone struck the surrounding walls. The energy that had been circulating through the tower spilled outward in a sudden surge, racing through the copper lattice beneath the streets. Across the city, lights flickered. Bridges dimmed. The long spiral canals that had glowed softly for generations went dark in several sections at once. People stopped moving and looked toward the towers. Another tremor rolled through the ridge. This one lasted longer. A low, grinding sound rose from beneath the city, like distant thunder echoing through stone caverns. The streets shook hard enough to send loose blocks sliding from the edges of the unfinished structures. At the southern edge of the city, the first tower collapsed. It leaned slowly at first, the crystal spire at its top bending a few degrees out of alignment. Engineers nearby ran forward instinctively, as if the structure could somehow be steadied by human hands. Then the foundation split. The tower dropped. Stone slabs cracked apart as the entire structure folded inward on itself. The crystal core inside the tower flashed once, brilliant white, before vanishing beneath the falling stone. Dust rolled across the surrounding plazas. For several seconds, the entire city seemed to freeze. Then the horns began sounding again. This time the tone was different. Lower, urgent. Evacuation. Across Atlantis, people began moving quickly through the streets. Some headed toward the higher rings of the city. Others ran for the harbor where ships were already struggling against the violent movement of the water. Inside the council chamber, The Atlantean engineers stared at the latest readings arriving through the crystal rods. The resonance lines had broken apart completely. Energy that once moved through controlled pathways was now scattering in every direction as towers failed and grid connections collapsed. One of the older engineers spoke quietly. "The system is gone." Across the table, another voice answered. "We still have the central array." Before anyone could respond, another runner entered the chamber, breathing hard. "The southern ring is breaking apart," he said. Several of the council members stood immediately. Across the room, the architects remained calm. One of them stepped toward the window that overlooked the city. From that height, the destruction was clear. Sections of the outer ring had begun to sink slightly as the crust beneath them shifted. Water flooded through cracked canal walls and poured into the lower districts. The architect studied the scene carefully. Fascination moved behind the alien eyes. "Remarkable," it said quietly. One of the Atlantean engineers turned sharply. "People are dying," he snapped. The architect did not look away from the window. "Every experiment produces loss," the figure replied. Silence filled the chamber. For the first time since the architects had arrived generations earlier, several of the Atlanteans understood what they were truly facing. These beings had never come to guide. They had come to test. Outside, the city continued to shake. Another tower cracked along its middle section and dropped into the canal beside it, sending a surge of water across the nearby streets. People ran now. Ships in the harbor fought to break free from their moorings as the ocean continued to rise and fall in powerful surges. Far beyond the coastline, the ridge beneath the Atlantic was opening wider with every passing minute. Molten rock pushed upward through fractures. Entire sections of the seafloor were lifting and collapsing in slow, violent motions. Back in Mu, the Lemurians stood quietly in the mineral pools as the pulse of the earth surged through the basin again. The elder watched the distant horizon. "They built their cities on a wound," he said. Around him, the others felt the same truth moving through the water beneath their feet. The earth had tolerated the imbalance for as long as it could. Now it was closing the fracture. Across the ocean, the towers of Atlantis were falling one by one, and the civilization that had mastered stone, sound, and energy for hundreds of thousands of years was discovering that even the greatest architecture cannot command the planet that carries it. The ridge continued to break, and the sea was rising. Chapter 19. The shaking continued through the night. In Atlantis, there was no true night as later ages would know it. The dense violet atmosphere scattered light across the sky long after the sun had dipped beyond the horizon. The towers usually glowed softly as their quartz cores carried the planet's energy upward through the city. Now the glow flickered. Sections of the skyline went dark one after another as towers failed or were shut down to prevent further surges. Where steady light had once shone, there were now uneven patches of dim crystal and long shadows stretching across the canals. Water still sloshed along the stone banks. Every few minutes, another tremor moved through the ground beneath the city. The council chamber had emptied, except for a handful of engineers and 3 architects. The Atlanteans who remained looked exhausted. Dust clung to their clothing from the collapse of the southern tower. One man had wrapped a cloth around his forearm, where a falling fragment of stone had cut through the skin. Across the room, the architects looked unchanged. They stood beside the tall windows overlooking the damaged rings of the city, their posture calm and perfectly balanced, even as the floor trembled again. One of the engineers stepped forward. His name was Arson, a builder who had worked with the Stone Guild since his youth. He had helped align the magnetite rails beneath 3 rings of the city and had overseen the construction of 2 crystal towers. His voice was controlled, but the strain beneath it was clear. "You told us the grid would stabilize the ridge." One of the architects turned his head slightly. "We told you it would redistribute planetary energy." "That's not what we understood." The architect studied him with interest. "That difference," it said calmly, "is interpretation." Another tremor passed through the chamber. Dust drifted down from a crack in the ceiling. Arson did not move. "The ridge is breaking apart," he said. "Our towers are failing. Thousands of people are trying to reach the harbor. You advised us to continue drawing energy even after the fractures began." The architect walked slowly toward the long table where the resonance charts were still spread across the surface. Its long fingers rested lightly on the stone. "The experiment required full saturation of the grid," it replied. The word hung in the air. Experiment. The other engineers exchanged glances. Arson's eyes narrowed slightly. "Experiment," he repeated. "Yes." The architect traced one of the resonance lines with a finger. "When we arrived, your civilization had already mastered acoustic levitation, crystal storage, and mineral conduction. Your progress was unusually rapid." "Because we listened to the Earth," Arson said sharply. "Yes," the architect agreed. "That made you ideal." Silence filled the chamber. Arson felt something cold move through his chest. "You used us," he said. The architect did not appear offended. "Used is an emotional term." "What term do you prefer?" "Observed." Another engineer stepped forward now, a woman named Salat, who had spent decades working inside the crystal amplifiers. "You knew the ridge would fail," she said quietly. "We predicted the possibility." "And you did nothing to stop it?" The architect tilted its head slightly. "Stopping it would have ended the experiment." Outside the window, another tower leaned dangerously as the ground beneath it shifted. A section of canal wall collapsed into the water with a dull crash. Arson looked at the city he had helped build. Then he turned back to the architect. "You came to study the planet." "Yes." "You came to study us." "Yes." "And the destruction of our civilization is simply part of your data." The architect met his gaze. "Civilizations are temporary structures," it said. "Planetary systems are more valuable to study." The words landed heavily in the room. For the first time since the architects had appeared in Atlantis generations earlier, the Atlanteans saw them clearly. They had admired their knowledge. They had welcomed their ideas. They had believed the tall, quiet visitors were guides. But the beings standing before them were not teachers. They were observers. And Atlantis had been nothing more than a laboratory. Salat spoke again. "Did you ever intend to help us?" The architect considered the question. "We accelerated your development." "That is not the same thing." "No," the architect agreed. "It is not." Outside, another tremor rolled through the city. Far across the harbor, a third tower collapsed into the canal with a roar of breaking stone. Water surged across the streets as the displaced wave rushed through the outer rings. People shouted in the distance. Ships were pulling away from the docks now, their acoustic engines humming as crews prepared to leave the failing harbor. Arson looked back toward the architects. "If the ridge continues to open," he said, "the central array will overload." "Yes." "And the city will sink." "Yes." "Why are you still here?" The architect turned back toward the window. "We are documenting the final phase." The engineer felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat. "Of course you are." Another tremor struck. This one lasted long enough to send a deep, grinding sound through the foundations of the chamber. The resonance charts slid slightly across the table as the floor tilted, and then steadied again. Salat gathered the crystal rods containing the city's recorded data. Arson watched her carefully. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Preserving what we can." He nodded slowly. Atlantis might be ending, but the knowledge that had built it did not have to vanish with the towers. Around them, the ground trembled again. The architects continued watching the collapse with quiet fascination. But the Atlanteans had already begun thinking about something very different. Survival. And what parts of their world could still be carried forward into the next one. Chapter 20. The tremors did not stop. By the time the remaining leaders of Atlantis gathered again, the city had already begun to change shape. Several outer canals had broken through their retaining walls, and water now flowed through streets that had once carried only foot traffic. A fine layer of stone dust hung in the air, drifting slowly through the open arches of the council hall. The chamber itself had been built to endure strain. The ceiling rested on thick columns of interlocking stone, and the floor was a single slab cut directly from the ridge beneath the city. Even so, a long crack now ran across the far wall, thin but unmistakable. No one mentioned it. About 30 people sat around the great stone table. Guild leaders, navigators, engineers, and archivists. Many had spent their entire lives working inside the systems that held the city together. Now, those systems were failing. Arson stood near the center of the room, his hands resting on the edge of the table. Salat sat beside a stack of long crystal rods, each one filled with recorded information pulled from the towers before they collapsed. Outside the hall, the warning horns continued to sound at steady intervals. The harbor evacuation had begun. Arson looked around the chamber. "We cannot hold the ridge," he said plainly. No one argued. For centuries, the Atlanteans had mastered stone, sound, and crystal. They had lifted mountains from the ground and shaped them into cities that glowed at night like constellations fallen to earth. But none of those skills could close a tectonic fracture. Salat spoke next. "The central array will fail soon," she said. "When it does, the remaining towers will release their stored energy at once." "How long?" one of the navigators asked. Salat looked down at the newest readings etched into the crystal rods. "Hours, perhaps less." Silence moved slowly around the table. One of the older builders leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. "So this is how Atlantis ends," he said. Arson shook his head. "No." Everyone looked toward him. "This city ends," he continued. "That is not the same thing." A younger engineer frowned. "You think we can build somewhere else?" "Not immediately," Arson replied. "The knowledge we built here took generations to develop." Salat lifted one of the crystal rods. "But the knowledge itself still exists." She held the rod up so the others could see the faint patterns of light moving inside the clear quartz. "This contains the full acoustic tables for levitation," she said. "Frequency maps for basalt, granite, limestone, and magnetite. Construction methods for large stone arrays." Another rod followed. "This one holds the geometry for the towers and the energy amplifiers." One of the archivists leaned forward. "You transferred the libraries?" "Not all of them," Salat admitted. "Several towers collapsed before we reached their records, but enough remains." The older builder let out a whistle. "So the city sinks," he said slowly, "but the knowledge sails away." "That is the idea." A navigator spoke from the far end of the table. "How many vessels are ready?" 23, Arson answered. "More if we convert some of the cargo platforms." "Destinations?" "Anywhere stable." Several people laughed quietly at that. One of the engineers leaned forward with a grin despite the circumstances. "I vote we avoid mid-ocean ridges this time." The room filled with a brief ripple of dry laughter. Even Salat smiled. For a moment, the tension eased. Then the ground trembled again. Dust drifted from the cracked wall. Arson placed both hands on the table. "We cannot save Atlantis," he said again, "but we can prevent the loss of everything we've learned." He gestured toward the crystal rods. "Stone libraries, portable." An archivist nodded slowly. "The lithic records." "Yes." Another engineer frowned thoughtfully. "How many can we move?" As many as we can carry," Salat said. "But we must choose carefully. The vessels cannot hold everything." That began the argument, not angry, but passionate. Builders insisted the stone-moving techniques were essential. Navigators argued for star maps and ocean currents. Engineers demanded the resonance table be preserved in full. One mathematician spoke up quietly. "If future generations recover only fragments," he said, "they may misuse them." Arson looked at him. "That may happen," he admitted, "but ignorance guarantees it." The man nodded reluctantly. The debate continued for nearly an hour. Every few minutes another tremor reminded them how little time remained. Finally, Arson raised his hand. "We preserve the foundations," he said. "The principles, not every calculation." Salat nodded. "Enough for someone to rebuild responsibly." The older builder leaned forward again. "And the architects?" The room grew quiet. Everyone in the chamber knew what he meant. Those beings still stood somewhere in the city, watching its collapse. Arson's answer was simple. "They are not invited." Another rumble passed through the stone floor. Far outside the chamber, the harbor horns sounded a new signal. Departure. The ships were leaving. Arson looked around the table one final time. "Take what you can carry," he said. "Meet at the eastern docks." He paused, before adding one final thought. "And try not to argue about mathematics while the planet is breaking apart." That earned another short burst of tired laughter. Then the Council of Atlantis stood for the last time, and the work of saving their civilization, what little of it could still be saved, began immediately. Outside, the sea continued to rise. Chapter 21. The harbor was already flooding when the final vessels launched. A navigator stood on the command deck of a long-range exploration craft, built for deep ocean travel. The vessel was not large, but it was strong. The hull was layered with reinforced stone composite and resonance-stabilized metal plates designed to absorb violent water pressure. Below him, hundreds of people moved along the docks. Some were engineers, some were scholars, some were children who had never left the city. They boarded quickly, carrying only sealed containers and small instruments. No furniture, no possessions, only knowledge. A young technician secured a crate beside the navigation console. "Crystal archives," she said. "Education records, harmonic mathematics, stellar charts." The navigator nodded. Those crates contained the only surviving records of Atlantean science. Behind them, the city trembled again. Stone towers leaned toward the sea as sections of the foundations sank. The tsunami reached the outer harbors first. Stone docks shattered as the water climbed over them. Ships broke loose from their anchors and crashed into the city walls. In the resonance chamber, the crystal lattice finally failed. A deep crack split the central column from top to bottom. The towers along the ridge shut down at the same moment, but the damage was already done. Sections of the mid-Atlantic ridge collapsed in a chain reaction. Large portions of the Atlantean landmass began sinking as the crust shifted beneath it. Buildings tilted. Streets split open. Water poured through the lower districts. The navigator turned to the crew. "Release the anchors." The vessel lifted slowly as its buoyancy engines activated. Another wave rolled into the harbor and smashed against the outer walls. The ship cleared the breakwater just as a section of the harbor collapsed into the ocean. The navigator did not look back again. Atlantis was gone, but its knowledge was still aboard the vessel. The fleet divided into several groups within hours of departure. Each group carried part of the surviving knowledge. One vessel headed south. The Antarctic stabilizer station still functioned beneath the ice, and the engineers believed it could help them rebuild the planetary balance. Days later, the ship entered colder waters. Icebergs drifted slowly across the gray ocean. The sky was clear, but the magnetic instruments fluctuated constantly. The ship reached the Antarctic shelf just before nightfall. A narrow entrance between two ice ridges led into a hidden inlet. The navigator guided the vessel inside. Massive stone structures stood partially buried in ice along the shoreline. Ancient. Built long before Atlantis itself. The Polar Stabilizer Complex. Engineers moved quickly across the frozen ground, reopening sealed access tunnels beneath the ice. Inside the underground chambers, harmonic instruments still vibrated with a weak planetary signal. The system had not completely failed. The navigator looked at the surviving engineers. "We can stabilize what we can," he said. "Then we move the rest of the knowledge north." The storm lasted for days. When the sky finally cleared, only scattered islands remained where the Atlantean continent had once stood. Across the Pacific, Mu remained intact, but silent. The elder walked along the shoreline where the ocean had pulled back unusually far. He placed his hand in the water. The planetary pulse was still there, weaker, but alive. He looked east once more. Atlantis had tried to control the current. Mu had always listened to it. The difference had changed the course of the world. Chapter 22. Another group sailed east. Weeks later, their ships entered the Mediterranean basin. The coastline of northern Africa appeared slowly through the desert haze. They landed near a broad limestone plateau west of the narrow river valley, the Nile. The leader of the expedition, an engineer named Kael, stepped onto the dry ground. He was greeted by the Atlanteans who had come to this lush river basin hundreds of years before. Hot wind moved across the land, bringing the scent of cinnamon and spices and the faint traces of the violet breath. "The current still runs here?" Kael asked. "It does," said an Atlantean from the group that greeted them, faint violet eyes glinting in the sunlight. He pointed behind him in a sweeping gesture. Stonecutters shaped massive limestone blocks using harmonic resonance tools. Instead of striking the stone with metal, they used focused vibration to weaken precise lines inside the rock. The blocks separated cleanly. Teams of builders guided them into position using counter-frequency lifting platforms. No ropes, no pulleys. The stone floated briefly as the harmonic field balanced its weight. "The structures will stabilize the current," an Atlantean explained to the younger builders, "and it will preserve what we know." Pyramids rose above the desert. Not tombs, resonance anchors. Another surviving fleet traveled west across the Atlantic before turning south into the mouth of a massive river, the Amazon basin. Dense forests stretched across the horizon in every direction. An explorer guided the vessels through winding channels deep into the interior. The air was warm and heavy with moisture. Strange animal calls echoed through the trees at night. Eventually, they reached a large clearing where ancient stone circles already stood, older than Atlantis, Lemurian stabilizers. The explorer stepped onto one of the moss-covered stones. The structure vibrated gently beneath his feet. He knelt and placed a harmonic tuning instrument against the surface. The device aligned almost instantly. "These were built to the same planetary frequency," he said. The Lemurian builders had once traveled here. The explorer looked at the forest around them. "This is where we continue their work." The Atlantean survivors began rebuilding the ancient stabilizer rings and adding new harmonic towers deeper in the jungle. Over centuries, the jungle slowly swallowed the structures again, but they remained active beneath the soil. A third group crossed the Pacific. Their ships followed the long spine of volcanic islands until they reached the western edge of South America. Massive mountains rose sharply from the coastline, the Andes. An engineer climbed the steep ridge overlooking the valley where they had landed. She placed a resonance rod into the ground. The signal returned immediately, strong. The mountains carried deep quartz veins connected directly to the planetary mantle currents. "This is another anchor point," she said. Stone terraces appeared along the mountainside over the following decades, platforms aligned with the stars and the Earth's magnetic lines. Later civilizations would inherit those sites, but they would never fully understand how they were built. Scrolls, chants, and etched symbols became cryptic. Rituals preserved fragments, but much was misunderstood or ignored. The pulse could no longer be perceived by ordinary senses. Humanity forgot their harmonics and the ways of Mu and Atlantis. Far beneath the ocean's surface, some Atlantean structures survived the collapse. Not cities, but research stations built along the deeper ridge segments. Inside one sealed chamber, automatic harmonic systems continued operating. The instruments monitored tectonic movement and ocean current changes. Thousands of years passed. Sediment covered the outer walls. Marine life grew over the structures. But deep inside, the machines continued quietly stabilizing the planetary current, waiting for someone to rediscover them. Back in the Pacific, the Lemurian elder met with the surviving councils. They had watched the fall of Atlantis. They had seen the survivors scatter across the world. Some younger Lemurians wanted to rebuild the old global network immediately. The elder disagreed. "The planet must settle first," he said. "Forcing the system again would repeat the same mistake." "So we do nothing?" one of them asked. The elder shook his head. "We observe, we guide quietly when needed." He looked out over the Pacific Ocean. "One day, the surface civilizations will search for what they have lost. When that happens, we will decide whether they are ready." The elder stood knee-deep in the warm mud pool as the sun rose over the Pacific basin. The pulse had weakened, but it had not died. He closed his eyes and listened. Far across the planet, the Atlanteans were rebuilding. Their structures were smaller now, simpler, cruder. But the intention was still there. To stabilize the planet's rhythm, the elder exhaled slowly. "Good," he whispered. The children of Mu gathered quietly along the pool's edge. "What are they doing?" one asked. The elder looked toward the rising sun. "They are remembering." Children sat in a circular chamber carved deep beneath the surface. The walls were smooth stone. In the center of the room stood a small crystal mounted on a carved pedestal. The teacher struck a tuning rod gently against the crystal. A clear tone filled the chamber. The children felt the vibration travel through the stone floor beneath them. "This is how the planet speaks," the teacher explained. He struck the rod again at a slightly different frequency. The tone changed. "The earth carries many signals at once. The oceans, the mantle, the magnetic field, they all move together." One of the students raised a hand. "Is that how Atlantis fell?" The teacher paused. "Yes," he said. "They forgot to listen." Epilogue. Millennia passed, oceans shifted, mountains eroded, human memory forgot. Yet the pulse never fully died. Beneath deserts, under the sands of Egypt, stones still hummed with the vibration of the old world. Quartz pyramids trapped energy as the Atlanteans once did, and ley lines mapped themselves in faint, enduring currents. In trenches, deeper than sunlight ever touched, beings of flowing form moved among glass-like wreaths. Some were the descendants of Lemurians, others Atlantean custodians. They swam through harmonic currents, crystalline shards embedded in crystalline wreaths, monitoring vibrations across oceans. Occasionally, a distant sonar ping from the surface explorers stirred the water, causing a shimmer of light, a ripple echoing through millennia of hidden knowledge. The architects linger in the shadows, their forms unreadable, an interplay of energy and impossible geometry. They watched silently, energy bending impossibly, tracing satellites, sonar, and deep-sea probes. The pulse was faint, muted beneath concrete and asphalt, but it reached them still through veins of magnetic tension. "Fragile," one vibrated through the air. "Awakening," replied the other. Their perception traced the Amazon stone rings, Antarctic tunnels, Egyptian chambers, and deep ocean towers. Threads of a network long dormant began to hum, brushing continents with an invisible rhythm. Scholars rediscover them now, artifacts that hum, stones that respond to touch, structures that seem impossibly aligned with the stars. Cymatic experiments, long dismissed as quackery, reveal frequencies that move matter, just as the Atlanteans knew. Ancient canals and underground chambers pulse subtly, waiting for the right hands to awaken them. The architects are gone from view. Atlantis and Mu exist only in fragments and whispers, but the current, the living, vibrating pulse of Earth, flows still. Those who remember, those who study, those who feel it under their feet, understand. The world is alive. It always has been and always will be, even if the civilizations that once danced upon it are buried, secret, or hidden. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining me for Echoes of My Imagination. I do hope you enjoyed the lost currents of Atlantis and Mu. Don't forget to subscribe, share, like, and follow. And I'll catch you next time.